All right, so in just a few hours from now, a major deal touted as a peace deal is expected to be signed in Doha between the representatives of the United States and the Taliban. Now, the Americans are selling this as a peace deal for Afghanistan. The U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has already arrived in Doha for this landmark peace deal. And in a short while from now, the representatives of the Taliban, the United States and the NATO will be holding a joint press conference as well. Meanwhile, the representatives of the Taliban have said that they are looking forward for the deal to bring about peace and stability in Afghanistan. Listen in.
امیر اولو افغانستان ته سوله راولو اول سره څخه زموږ پیغام د سولې او د ارامۍ و دا جګړه پر موږ باندې تحمیل شوې ده افغانستان اشغال شوی ده او تر د اشغال مخکې د اسلامي نظام موجود و او د امریکایانو له لورې په دې افغانستان باندې یرغل وسو دا دربدري و خشونت و هر څه د اشغال دې به تر اوسه پورې د هغوی سره هېڅ توافق نه ده شوی ځکه چې دا یو خارجي بود ده چې دغه پای ته ورسېږي له دې وروسته به بیا بین الافغاني مذاکراتو ته لار هواره.
All right, so that was Ahmedullah, one of the representatives of the Taliban there, making a very important point, saying that this peace deal will usher in an era of peace, but he has said that there is no agreement between the Taliban and the Kabul administration at this point of time. Now, the entire world will, of course, have its eyes focused on this particular event. WION is the only Indian news network that is presently there in Doha, in Qatar. And we'll, of course, be getting you the updates as they emerge about this peace deal for Afghanistan. Now, the specific details, the form and structure of this agreement has not been given out by the Americans. But what we can tell you are the broad outlines. The Americans claim that this agreement will pave the way for some kind of a partial withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan. Now remember, the United States invaded Afghanistan back in the year 2001 in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks in the much-touted war against terror. They were immediately able to upseat the Taliban, but from there on, Taliban has fought a bloody insurgency and has virtually fought the Americans to a stalemate. And at this point of time, the Taliban either governs or contests nearly about 70% of the territory in Afghanistan, and it is this very group that the Americans are now striking a deal with. Now, ahead of signing the deal, the Taliban had agreed to implement not a ceasefire, this again is very crucial, not a ceasefire but a reduction in violence which began on the 22nd of February. This was being seen as a confidence-building measure, something that the Americans said that they are assured that the Taliban is willing to sign this particular deal. Now, the goal of these peace talks is supposed to be to form some kind of a power-sharing agreement between the politicians, that is the Kabul administration of Ashraf Ghani and the Taliban. But what is interesting, and many would say shocking, is that the Kabul administration has not been a part of this negotiation between the United States and the Taliban. Representatives from 26 countries will be taking part in this deal signing agreement today. Now, Qatar has asked India to send a representative, and New Delhi has, of course, accepted the invitation. All right, now to add more perspective in terms of what this deal will look like, is it indeed a peace deal as the Americans are claiming it to be? We are joined in by WION's Anas Malik, who is joining us live from Doha in Qatar. We're also joined in by our principal diplomatic correspondent, Sushant Saleem, who is joining us live from New Delhi. And we'll also, in just a bit, we're joined by Sushant Saleem, who's also a strategic affairs expert. Now, Anas, let me begin by asking you this. We are virtually inching closer to the moment when this peace deal is expected to be signed. But what is the expectation right now in Doha between the different representatives that you've spoken? Will this deal really usher in peace?
Well, Saleh, in about 2 hours from now is when the event of the signing of the agreement for peace in Afghanistan, as it's being titled here in Doha, would be starting, and we're expecting the deal to be signed somewhere by 4:15 Doha time. Now, I happen to have spoken to a lot of Taliban representatives. So I happen to have spoken to the German Special Envoy for Afghanistan, the Russian Special Envoy for Afghanistan. I also spoke to a number of other foreign ministers off camera, but they were all hopeful. By and large, the only commonality that I found is that they were all hopeful with this deal being in place that yes, it could possibly bring in peace back to Afghanistan. Though there is some skepticism about the fact that there would be spoilers, and how would the US and Taliban both be dealing with those spoilers, because we understand that day before yesterday and on on Tuesday rather, we saw 2 attacks in Kabul, those which were being said that they were conducted by the Taliban. The Taliban immediately refuted and said that and distanced themselves from that. And then a day later, we saw the ISIS Khorasan chapter or the Islamic State Khorasan chapter acknowledging that they have conducted those VBIED operations in Kabul. So, as I said, there would be spoilers, and to hold through upon the deal, even with those spoilers, is something of a challenge for both the Taliban and the US, and that is yet to be seen. We saw that US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has arrived. Zalmay Khalilzad was also here a while ago at the media camp, and in a while from now the deal would be signed. Yes, Saleh.
Absolutely indeed. Do continue to stay on with us, Anas, and let me also get in my colleague Sushant Saleem is joining us live from New Delhi. Sushant, India is of course taking part in this deal signing agreement. India is there as an observer. What is India's expectations with this? How are we looking at it?
Well, in next few hours, we know one of the biggest geopolitical developments of this century is likely to take place. This could herald the exit of the American troops. And what would India like to see? India would like to see that in the aftermath of this deal, when the Americans leave, the territory in Afghanistan is not used by Pakistan-based terrorists for any anti-India activity. New Delhi has conveyed this to its American counterparts. And of course, something which is on top of the mind is the increased influence Pakistan would like to see in Kabul. This could, of course, jeopardize India's planning with what India is doing, the development programs, the development of infrastructure programs, capacity building, which India is taking. India would not like to definitely see the repetition of what happened in 90s. Pakistan had a strategic leverage in Kabul, and they, of course, wanted a bleeding India. And, of course, we saw the number of attacks, cross-border terrorism in 90s, especially in the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir, significantly increased.
Right, all right. Some interesting points raised there. Do continue to stay on with us, Siddhant. And meanwhile, we also joined in by Sushant Saleem, who is a strategic affairs expert. Now, Sushant, let me begin by asking you this. A lot of people are looking at this peace deal with a lot of skepticism. Some have even described this as perhaps a withdrawal deal for the Americans. What do you make of it?
Well, clearly, it's not a peace deal. A peace deal is the embellishment which has been put on what is effectively a withdrawal deal. And what kind of peace are we talking about? Is handing over control to the Taliban or making them the principal player in Afghanistan going to usher in peace? And peace of what kind? Now, there is peace, which is the good peace, but there is also the peace of the graveyard, which is what the Taliban are infamous for. What is it? If this indeed is a peace deal, then in a peace deal, there's give and take. Now, I don't know what is the gift from the from the Taliban side. Actually, I often confuse the Taliban with the Pakistanis because I don't make much of a distinction between the two. But what is the gift from their side? All the concessions and all the give has been from the American side, and all the take has been from the Taliban side. So how does this actually translate into anything good happening insofar as Afghanistan is concerned? The second thing is that at best, this deal will have some kind of a timetable of complete US withdrawal, some conditions-based thing that could drag on for about 9 months, 18 months. We are hearing various, numbers of how long this whole thing will unfold. But in the meantime, the Taliban have not said that they will open up negotiations with the Afghan government for some kind of a power-sharing deal. They are saying that we will hold an intra-Afghan dialogue,
Right.
but they are not saying, they don't even recognize the Afghan government. So where does that leave the Afghan government? Where does that leave the Afghan state? So effectively, what the Americans are going to end up doing is making the Taliban the principal players to the
Right.
exclusion of everybody else, and everybody else comes into this whole arrangement at the sufferance of the Taliban.
Absolutely. Now, Sushant, you mentioned that there could be a possibility of a complete withdrawal by the American troops. Do you think that is a realistic expectation?
Well, why is it not a realistic expectation? The Americans might want to stay on, but is it possible, is it even conceivable for them to stay on, given the fact that the Taliban don't want them to stay on indefinitely? There might be some, short-term deal kind of a thing for a year, maybe 2 years, maybe 5 years, where the Americans will lease out the bases. But where does that then leave the Taliban narrative that they need to get rid of all foreign forces from Afghanistan? It is one thing to say that, there's a timetable within 12 months, 18 months, all the foreign forces will leave. It's quite another to sign a deal to hand over 1 or 2 or more bases to the Americans. Now, while that will bring in money for Afghanistan, maybe a couple of $1 billion, but how do the Taliban handle that at the political level? So one needs to see how that plays out. One needs to see how the Pakistanis play this one out, because while they will be crowing with victory at this point in time, will this change the dynamics inside Afghanistan in the sense lower or end the Taliban dependence on the Pakistanis for safe havens, sanctuaries, for support, for sustenance, for all sorts of other things? And if that happens, then will we see a different dynamic come into play in this region? So those are imponderables. We can only speculate on those things.
That is true. That is something that we'll be talking about in just a bit. But Anas, if I can get you in on this, the fact of the matter is, over the course of the last few months, as we've been heading slowly towards this deal, Taliban has been trying to project a more moderate image of itself. For instance, they've said that women will have rights in carrying out businesses, in ownership, inheritance, education, work, etc. When you're talking with the representatives there, what is the sense that you get? Because with this peace deal, with the Americans trying to make a retreat, and the Kabul administration not having even been a part of this negotiation process, if the Taliban, which it is likely to become the principal player in Afghanistan again, will it again go back to the era of 1996 till 2001, at the time that they had ruled with a very, very strict and bizarre interpretation of the Sharia?
Well, there are two prospects to what you've asked. The first thing first being is, would the Taliban be willing to adopt change? Prima facie, yes, they are willing to adopt change. They are, at least on the face of it, saying that, yes, they would want to give rights to women, education, they would let them continue to work. But that is prima facie, because as per their previous interpretation of Sharia, things were not, the case was not the same as what they are trying to portray it for now. And yes, the Taliban would want to say that, yes, we've evolved, we have changed, we have understood, we understand the modern dynamics very well, but that is just prima facie, because the second aspect to this is that they have not given up their identity. They are signing this agreement as the Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan and not just as a banned political entity. So then again, the second thing that comes in is what would be the interpretation of Islamic Emirat of Afghanistan when it comes to Sharia, and that is that one big question that all of the stakeholders would want to ensure given at any point of time, be the United States, the NATO, or the United Nations as well, because that is one big question mark that nobody is able to explain, at least for now, that what would be the exact interpretation of Sharia when the Taliban come into power through that power sharing formula that is agreed upon in the intra-Afghan dialogue that will take place somewhere in 10 to 12 days once this deal is signed. Yes,
absolutely, indeed. Do continue to stay on with us, Anas. And Siddhant, if I can get you in on this, a lot of people are looking at this peace deal with a lot of skepticism. Many have said that, this may not lead to any kind of peace within Afghanistan. But with the Americans signing this peace deal with the Taliban, does it mean the mainstreaming of the Taliban, so to put it?
Well, Mohammed, history first repeats as tragedy, then as far as and then on social media. This time it's on social media. In 1800s, the British exit Afghanistan. Then in 1900s, we saw Soviet Russian, and this time 2020, we are looking at American withdrawal from Afghanistan. Will this lead to peace in Afghanistan? Will the Taliban's focus on the agreement? Will they fulfill all the points in the agreement, which of course has not been told to the world right now? Is something only we have to wait and watch. But if we look at the Taliban side, they are of course very happy given the fact that they are coming back to Afghanistan. They will be back in Kabul. They will be back in the Afghan society. And also this is a cause of concern for India because as we have been talking about in 90s, what was the relationship? India had no ties with Taliban, and the memories of IC-814, the plane that was hijacked from Kathmandu and taken to Kandahar. It was surrounded by Taliban. Of course, we know they played an obstructionist role. So we have to wait and watch. But will it lead to end of the 40 years of conflict in Afghanistan? Is something that everyone is hoping for. As the Americans said, that everyone is tired. The Americans are tired. The Taliban are tired. But it should translate into peace, and everyone is hoping that whether it's in New Delhi, Islamabad, Doha or Kabul.
Absolutely, indeed. That is something that we'll have to look at, whether peace indeed is ushered in by this deal that is being signed. Now, Sushant, I want you to weigh in a bit in terms of how India has strategized itself in what is playing out in Afghanistan. India has said that they would like to back the peace process there, that is Afghan-led and Afghan-owned. We have not dealt with the Taliban. We've never negotiated with the Taliban for a peace deal within Afghanistan, but we are there now as an observer. How do you see India now leveraging all of this?
Okay, before I come to your question, let me just clarify one or two things. I disagree with Siddhant when he says all sides are tired. Yes, the Americans are showing visible signs of fatigue, but we haven't seen any signs of fatigue from the Taliban or the terrorist side.
Right.
I think the terrorists remain as robust as ever. Their networks are pretty much intact. And I don't see, if they were tired, there would have been some gift from their side. Secondly, what is the change which has come in the Taliban which makes many people so optimistic that they have changed? There's not a single indication of there's any change coming into them. Number three, I agree with what Anas said, that, the Sharia is not codified. The Sharia is what the Taliban say it is. Let's be very, very clear about that. And number four, this whole business of what the Taliban did in the 90s and all of it, I think it's a little more complicated. Number one, what the Taliban did in the 1990s, there was nothing they could do directly against India. Our basic problem is Pakistan. So the Taliban are not going to dig a tunnel from inside Pakistan to come into India. It's the Pakistanis who use the Taliban territory or the Afghan territory and for various camps and all. So our problem will remain what it always has been, which is Pakistan, and we need to settle that there more than anything else. The second thing is, let us also remember, Pakistan of the 1990s, when the Taliban had taken over control of Afghanistan, is not the Pakistan of the 2020s.
Absolutely.
In the 1990s, Pakistan still had a somewhat functional economy. Pakistan still had a reasonably decent image in the rest of the world. Their passport wasn't the worst passport or the second worst passport in the world. There are many, many things which go along with it. People were also not savvy about the kind of double games and the treachery which the Pakistanis are famous for. All of that has now come to the fore. So for the Pakistanis to continue to be playing the same role which they played in the 90s and 2020s, I don't see how that's going to be really possible. A quarter century has gone by.
Right.
So I don't see that play out very well. So I think we need to be careful on how this works. What will India do? I think India has been a bit of a bystander. I don't see we don't have too many options right now, partly because we never created those options. We were very happy riding the shoulders of the Americans in Afghanistan. We did whatever developmental work we did. We earned some brownie points because of that. But that's where it all ends. We neither determine play a determining role in bringing peace to Afghanistan, nor do we play a role in, ushering in war in Afghanistan. So if you're neither responsible for any for war or for peace, then, at best you're sitting on the sidelines watching the tamasha. And for now, we are more or less out. They brought us into Qatar to see the signing deal, to not keep us completely out, to also make us a sort of a stakeholder. But that's kind of lip service they are paying to us. Ultimately, when things will happen in Afghanistan, new windows of opportunities will open up for us. And I only can hope that this time around, we are not going to go into Afghanistan riding on somebody else's shoulder, but on our own steam. We develop our own leverages and linkages and use them to our benefit, rather than, playing second fiddle to some other power, which is what we did when the Soviets were there, which is what we have done when the Americans were there.
Absolutely, indeed. It is a very, very complex situation in Afghanistan. It remains to be seen as to what the final form and shape of this peace deal is likely to be. Thank you very much indeed to Anas Malik, to Sushant Saleem, and also to Sushant Saleem for joining us on this broadcast, because this is a very complex situation there. It's a peace deal is how Donald Trump is trying to sell it to the rest of the world. A lot of people have described this as essentially just a withdrawal deal. But what do the people within Afghanistan feel about this? What are their expectations? Do they think that peace will be brought about? Remember, the elected government in Kabul has not even been a part of the negotiation process. Our Kabul's correspondent, Mustafa Kazimi, has sent us this report in terms of what the locals in Afghanistan feel about this peace deal. Listen.
Well, there's a mix of hope and skepticism in Afghanistan. The people are partially saying that the Afghan people have been the actual victims of the violence and the actual war between the Taliban and the United States, the Afghan government, for over 19 years, since 2001 when the U.S. invaded Afghanistan. And they believe that the first deal, the first signature that will happen within a few hours in Doha, must have been between the Taliban and the Afghan people and the Afghan government, not with the United States, because the prime victim of this violence, this 19 years long war, was the Afghan people. But on the other side, the hope has been increased and people are most hopeful. They're saying with whomever the deal is being signed, we are careless about that. We just want an end to be put to this war. And as we have seen the 6-member delegation from the Afghan government already in prison in Doha, still unknown who have invited this 6-member delegation to Doha. But we now know that the Taliban has openly claimed that they will not speak to this 6-member delegation from the Afghan government, which has created a sort of negative aura against this signature signing, the deal signing ceremony. And on the other hand, the Afghan government has unofficially acknowledged that they have sent this delegation, unofficial, I reiterate, to open the doors for the intra-Afghan talks, which will happen following the signing ceremony between the United States and the Taliban.
All right, Mustafa Kazimi there, our correspondent from Kabul, getting us the expectations which the people of Afghanistan have from this peace deal. Of course, we'll be getting you the updates as they emerge in Doha. But for the time being, that's all the time we have in this edition of the News Bulletin. Stay tuned to WION.